John Fredericks Radio Network. Joining us now on the John Fredericks Radio Show, Nick Freitas. Nick, House of Delegates member of Virginia, Culpeper, and he's a leading candidate for Congress, District 7, to take on, as the Republican nominee, Abigail Spanberger in November, and he's with us now. Nick, great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me on, John.
All right, Nick, let's start with a little political business. And just as a complete disclaimer, I personally endorsed Nick Freitas for Congress. I think he'd be the best candidate. Other candidates, all nice people. I think Freitas can win. That's why I did that. So just a disclaimer there. Nick, let's get to your convention. When is it? How does it work? What's going on? Give us an update.
So right now it's looking like they might be trying to hold a physical convention on July 18th. I think the 7th District still has to vote on that, but I know that's one of the options. And they've also looked at some potential alternatives like a drive-through convention and some things like that if we weren't able to hold a physical convention where we could all be in the same location. But I know that July 18th is one of the dates they're looking at potentially holding it.
Nick, what would allow that to happen? Like, what would Governor Northam have to do by July 17th to allow that to happen?
Well, obviously we'd have to be returning to, some degree of normalcy here where you would be allowed to have large-scale events in a location with multiple people attending. That's what would be required at this point.
I mean, do you see the guy won't even open up Virginia Beach? He won't open a restaurant up, putting hundreds and thousands of small businesses out into bankruptcy. I mean, if he doesn't open up Virginia Beach, that entire strip is gone. I mean, a lot of those people I know, their business depends on the summer. You wipe out the summer, they're in bankruptcy on the unemployment line. Do you actually see him doing that?
I really don't know. A lot can happen in 2 months, that's about the length of time between now and July 18th. A lot can happen within that time. We'll see what happens. I think a lot of people are getting very, very frustrated by the governor's management, and we'll just have to see.
Your committee is going to vote on the date, but then that's going to be determined on whether or not the government allows the gathering.
That's correct.
Right. So you vote on the date, you go from there, basically. Is that the way I understand it? All right. So
in the 7th District Committee.
In a convention now, all the delegate filings are in, right? I mean, that's done. You've either got the delegates or you don't. All those are closed. How do you guys look there, Nick?
We look very good. We're very confident about where we are in relation to the other candidates, and I think we will do very well at a convention.
So you're in good shape there. Now, let's get to the governor's response here. On May 15th, some businesses can open, but a lot of rules, like if you're a hair salon, you have to put appointments in your appointment book. You can't allow walk-ins, and restaurants still can't open, bars can't open, theaters can't open, movie theaters can't, bowling alleys no nail salons. But there's certain things nail salons, I'm not sure. But there's certain things you can do. You can eat outside. Where's he going with this?
Well, I think that's been part of the problem since this happened. I think when the governor first started putting in these restrictions, everybody was willing to give him a degree of latitude, but I think that patience is over at this point. And I think when you look at the sort of restrictions that he's coming up with now, instead of it's the typical government problem, right? You're trying to achieve a particular end state, and instead of the government saying, look, this is the end state, this is what we want to achieve, now private sector go out there and find new, innovative, and creative ways in order to conduct business, the government's trying to micromanage the process. And let's just take theaters, for instance. I mean, we've all been to a movie theater. You don't think there's a way that they could operate where they could have people go into a movie theater, maintain certain distances, and that are maintained at every other business, whether it's ABC stores or other things that are allowed to be open. That's the problem that I have with it, is telling a salon you can't have walk-ins. Well, okay, here's my question. If they're able to operate in a way that it would maintain the same safety standards that you get if they have a scheduled appointment, why wouldn't they be allowed to do that? We don't need to micromanage individual processes. You can tell the private sector, here's the guidelines that we're looking to achieve, but we don't need to be in there on the details with everything. If it's about maintaining social distancing, if it's about wearing PPE, okay, those are all things that might be good guidelines, but allow those businesses to come up with creative ways to do it. Don't try to micromanage the process, and that's the problem that we've had with the governor. I think him coming out and saying that, well, we're not going to do this regionally, it has to be all or nothing for Virginia is ridiculous. It treats every single county in Virginia as if it's exactly the same. And obviously, Alexandria, Fairfax, Richmond, these are all areas that are going to have to deal with this differently than a Culpeper and Amelia and Ottawa, a Lee County. And so by not even relaxing some of it to say, let's let localities come up with certain guidelines, I think is absurd.
So you've got, if you look at a map, or researcher Den Black provided this with, if you look at a map in Virginia, there's a host of counties without any deaths at all. None. Zero. So why can't they just go back to regular order?
Well, and again, I think this is the problem. Right? When President Trump was looking at guidelines, he didn't say the entire country has to operate the exact same way. He said, look, once we've met certain thresholds, allow people to open up, but ultimately we have a federalized system for a reason, and it's because we recognize that we can't micromanage the entire country from Washington, D.C. Well, just like we can't do that from Washington, D.C. for the entire country, we shouldn't be trying to micromanage the entire Commonwealth from Richmond. But again, some of this, I mean, when you have a political philosophy which rests on the idea that the government's got to have control, and we've got to be controlling things from a few people in a centralized location, you know, that's how they operate. That's how they attempt to operate when there isn't a crisis, and clearly when there is one, they just dial that up to 11, and it's really frustrating to watch.
You're on the John Fredericks Radio Network live in Virginia. We are with Nick Freitas, candidate for Congress, 7th District. That Republican nominee will be determined right now at a convention sometime over the summer. The date hasn't been set. The convention hasn't been allowed yet. It's all in flux. But if he is, he would go against Abigail Spanberger. Let me ask you, Nick, you've been fighting for civil liberties since I've met you. That's been your reputation. So before we get into Spanberger, let me just ask you a couple things. Have you been surprised at the country's willingness to forego their basic civil liberties guaranteed in the Constitution in order to follow these governor's edicts?
Yeah, I have. I think that, again, initially everybody was willing to give a great deal of latitude, but unfortunately you see with Governor Northam, I mean, he was rated as an F by the Wall Street Journal. You see what's going on in Michigan. I think we're getting to a point right now where, again, I'm concerned that people are willing to give the government way too much latitude with respect to handling a crisis. And ultimately, the Constitution was not just written for nice, sunny days. The Constitution was written for whatever circumstances that we find ourselves in. And it's important for elected officials to understand that they don't get to just arbitrarily suspend rights indefinitely. And I think you're seeing more and more pushback, and we've got some great organizations here in Virginia and whatnot that are stepping up and saying, wait a second, you cannot get away with this. Constitutionally, this is not permitted. And you've seen some cases now where Governor Northam has lost, whether it was with a gun range, whether it was with a pastor that he was threatening to put in jail for a year. And again, these organizations were not doing something that was inherently dangerous. They were finding ways to operate that met safety standards, but the government had decided that they weren't allowed to operate, and people are starting to push back now. And unfortunately, I wish it didn't require civil disobedience sometimes to push back against government overreach, but when you see the government operating in such a way, again, threatening a pastor who was having an event where everybody was able to maintain social distancing, everybody was able to, have PPE and to operate in a safe manner, to threaten them with jail time at the same time that the same governor says that abortion clinics can operate freely, that the ABC stores, which are run by the government, they can operate because they want to make sure they continue to get the tax revenue. That's the part that people are I think, rebelling against at this point. And again, I think we need the governor to understand that he has an obligation to protect civil liberties at all times. Mm-hmm. You can do so in a safe manner. Mm-hmm. I think American people are inherently reasonable. But once you start engaging in this kind of overreach, don't expect them to just sit there and comply indefinitely with the edicts coming out of Richmond.
Well, it's been incredible to me to see the level of submission and compliance. Let's get to these contact tracers. The governor says he's going to hire 1,000 contact tracers paid for by tax dollars, so you and I are going to be paying for it. And what these contact tracers do is, let's say somebody goes in the doctors and they test positive for COVID-19, then they have to give everybody they've come in contact with the next, the last month they can remember, they get their names and addresses. So if somebody's walking their dog and they have it and I'm walking by and I talk to them for a minute, then I get on the list, then they come to my home, then I can't go out for 14 days, and then they come and check at different times every day to be sure I'm home. And if I'm not home, I have to have papers as to why I'm out. But no, I can't be out at all now. And so I'll get a fine. And the second time, I'll get put in jail because now the jails are open because they're letting criminals out. What the hell is this about?
Oh, no, it's absurd. It's absurd. I don't think it's enforceable. I don't think people are going to stand for it. And like you said, I think you brought up a really good point as well. They're threatening they're threatening law-abiding citizens with these new restrictions and new rules. At the same time, and some of those threats come with potential jail time or other fines and fees. At the same time that they're fighting to release people that are already in jail, they released a cop killer the other day without even telling the family. So again, it's absurdity. This is the problem when the government tries to micromanage something. Put out guidelines, put out good information, do your job, which is to allocate resources that the government has in order to combat the threat. Send resources to areas where you have concentrated breakouts so that you can nip it in the bud. But my gosh, this idea of tracking people and then okay, what's the penalty if I forget that I talked to somebody a week ago because it was a brief conversation or I was just walking by them on the road? Am I in trouble now? These are the sort of problems that you get into. And no, I don't think people are going to stand for it. And ultimately, I don't think it creates a good situation for either health concerns, security concerns, or concerns over civil liberties.
And we have the pleasure of paying for our own persecution. That's the irony of this. You have to pay to be persecuted. It's the most insane thing.
Yeah, well, the government's also learning right now that there's always been this idea, and we've seen this in a couple areas where businesses were forced to shut down, but then they were getting notices that if they didn't pay their taxes, that they were going to face legal action. And we constantly have the fight down in Richmond. We had it down this session about fleecing taxpayers at every stop. And now some of my Democrat colleagues are starting to understand that, gosh, it's really hard to fleece taxpayers when you don't allow them to make money in the first place.
Unbelievable.
And this is the problem, right? There are people out there that honestly believe that the government comes first, right? The government has, power and authorities, and they're going to execute those authorities. Well, no, again, Reagan said it best, right? We are a people with a government, not a government with a people. And there's some very moral connotations to that, but there's also practical considerations as well. And this idea that the government would attempt to continue to fleece businesses, fleece taxpayers, well, okay, you got nothing to fleece if you're not actually allowing them to engage in commerce.
Unbelievable. We're with Nick Freitas running for Congress in the 7th District. One more question, then I'm going to get to Spanberger, but I just got to ask you this. You're in the House of Delegates. Did you realize under the Emergency Powers Act, which is like one paragraph buried somewhere, did you guys know how much power a governor had?
So, yeah, it's way too open-ended, and it's something that I've actually fought back before about this idea of civil liberties in a time of crisis and government's powers. And so I think it's something that we're going to go back and I mean, I know I'm certainly interested in the General Assembly revising what sort of powers the government has in an emergency crisis. But no, it's something I've been concerned with. And again, here's the problem. How do you write that so specifically that a governor doesn't go beyond their authority? And I think that you use the Constitution as a guide. You use basic civil liberties as a guide. Unfortunately, we have a lot of people that believe that in a time of crisis, the government should essentially just take everything over. And quite frankly, some of those people want the government to take everything over when we don't have a crisis. And so this fits into their political philosophy rather nicely. But I think that what I'm hoping for is that people are actually going to have more of an appetite to rein in government power after experiencing what we're going through right now.
Well, I should hope so. Right now, the polls are not reflecting that. And as the Speaker of the House, Georgia said to me when I was there 2 weeks ago, people are getting a taste of socialism, and some people really like sitting home in their pajamas and getting money wired into their bank account. They like it. So hey, this isn't so bad. All right, Nick, I want to get to a statement you made the other day. You slammed Democrat Congresswoman 7th District Abigail Spanberger. You said, look, she's actively campaigning for Biden. She refuses to address the Tara Reade sexual assault allegation, yet she believed Dr. Christine Blasey Ford And so you said this is the height of hypocrisy. You want to elaborate on that?
Sure. I think whenever somebody comes forward with a sexual assault claim, they should be taken seriously. And law enforcement should do everything they can to investigate that in order to make sure that if something has taken place, that the appropriate parties are punished. But you always treat the allegation seriously, and you treat the person bringing forward the allegation with respect, but then you also provide due process of law. That's always been the standard that I've applied to this. The problem is that's not the standard Democrats apply to this. Democrats have used this as a political tool, and that's my problem because I feel like they're undermining the entire process. And Joe Biden was big on this. Abigail Spanberger was big on this. They created a standard, and now they don't want to live by the standard. And my again, that's the hypocrisy involved in this entire case. Is that if your standard is believe all women, if your standard is that when somebody's accused of something like this, that's the end of their political career, well, then you have to apply that standard equally, or it's not a standard. Mm-hmm. And my hope is that we're going to get to a point where, again, when somebody feels like they have, or when somebody has been the victim of sexual assault, I want them to feel absolutely confident in their ability to come forward, be treated with respect, be treated with dignity, have an investigation, due process of law, and then if somebody is guilty, then they are prosecuted appropriately. That should be the standard. But unfortunately, the Democrats have chosen that there's one standard for them and their party, and there's a different standard for everybody else. And when you do something like that, what you're essentially saying is there is no standard. And that's my problem, is that I feel like it undermines this entire process. And again, I'm not surprised anymore. Abigail Spanberger has made a lot of claims when she was running for office the first time. She was a moderate. She was middle of the road. She was a problem solver. She wasn't a partisan. Well, now you're voting with Nancy Pelosi 96% of the time. You vote for impeachment, even though there was nowhere near the evidence to justify it. And now you're giving a pass to your own political party when there's sexual assault allegations. So, okay, show me how you're doing anything that you promised the voters you would do when you were running and, quite frankly, mocking David Brat. And so I think the people are going to see through this, and I think they're going to see the hypocrisy, and they're going to reject it in November.
So here's what Spanberger said during the Kavanaugh confirmation process. She said, this is a direct quote, "Watching the testimony of Dr. Ford, I'm impressed by her strength and poise and saddened by the pain her questioning is causing so many survivors of sexual assault." That was Spanberger in September of 2018. The Spanberger in 2020 completely rejects Tara Reade, blows her off. I guess she's not impressed by her poise. She's not saddened by her pain. And she doesn't care about her sexual assault, even though she's got people that she told about it immediately. And Dr. Ford couldn't remember where she was, when it happened, who was there, didn't tell anybody. And it was double the time ago. So Ford had no memory of anything, told no one. Tara Reade, on the other hand, told a bunch of people the next day and knew exactly where it was, what day it was, what time it was, and exactly what hall she was in. What's the deal? Why not just come clean here?
Well, it's simple, because she's endorsed Joe Biden, because she's actively campaigning with him. They're doing a town hall together to talk about health care. So that's the difference. One had a D by their name, and one they considered was a conservative. And if it's a conservative, well, then the standard that they've created applies, and if it's a Democrat, they want to pass. And you don't get to do that. If that's the standard you're going to apply, then you apply it to everyone equally. But, look, Spanberger understands. She's getting a lot of money from Nancy Pelosi's PAC. She wants to get a lot of money from the Biden campaign. She's not going to be able to do those things if she wants to apply the same standard to Biden that she applied to Kavanaugh. And I'm sorry, unless she wants to come out and actually explain what the difference is, because as you just articulated, by any measure that we actually look at the sort of evidence and testimony, we would say that there's a much stronger case against Biden. But again, nothing. She's actively campaigning with Joe Biden right now amidst all of this. She hasn't asked for Joe Biden to come clean with anything. She hasn't asked for, for his accuser to get a fair shot or her day in the court of either public opinion or a court of law. She hasn't done any of that. And so what's the difference? The difference is Joe Biden is her candidate.
Exactly. So it's the height of hypocrisy. These people stand for nothing. Spanberger lied when she, whined about Ford, lied when she ran. I mean, basically, she says she was a moderate. She was going to work with the president. She didn't do any of that stuff. Now she's just a slave to AOC and Pelosi and Schumer and the whole wing of the party. And of course, she's for mail-in ballots now. Let me just
John, real quick. Elizabeth Warren has a more bipartisan voting record than Abigail Spanberger.
What's that tell you?
What's
that tell you? Right. All right. Final thing. Only got a minute. What are the changes in voting in November, right? That got signed into law starting in July, so it isn't going to affect the primary. What's the voting changes in Virginia come November that was passed by the Democrats and signed by the governor?
So the different voting issues that took place within the General Assembly session, it got rid of voter ID. It allowed for same-day voter registration. Those two things right there are, I think, really bad policy when it comes to integrity of elections. There's two things that we're always fighting for: access to elections and integrity of elections. So we want as many people that can legally vote to vote, and then we want those elections to be open, honest, transparent. We don't want there to be a lot of things within the code that allows for gamesmanship or fraud. And unfortunately, the two things that I think actually kind of helped with voter integrity and the integrity of our elections was photo ID. And you had to register to vote. You couldn't register the same day. You couldn't walk into a polling location where they don't have any of the equipment really to validate that, yeah, you're legally present in the United States and allowed to vote in a particular district. They wanted to take all that away. And so, yeah, that's very problematic. The other thing that they did, which was incredibly bad, was during the veto session, the governor put an amendment in the budget where he basically moved a lot of the local elections that were supposed to take place in June to November. And what was so bad about that, and the bad precedent about that, was that, one, there were thousands of absentee ballots that had already been cast. They just threw them out. And they said, well, you'll get a chance to vote in November. Not only that, but the term that those elected officials are serving, whether it's on your board of supervisors, your town council, that term is over. And now all of a sudden they just got, 4 months added onto their term just by government fiat? I mean, think about that. I want you to think what would Democrats' reaction be if Donald Trump came out and said, you know what, it's just too dangerous to have an election in November, and so I'm just going to be president for the next 4 to 5 months until we have a safer time to do it. Democrats would lose their minds, and rightfully so. But when they've decided to do it with these local elections, I guess it's okay now. In fact, we were even accused that if we didn't agree with this, we were racist. Right, because that's what we're always accused of whenever we have a problem with a particular Democrat policy position. So as I look at this going forward, and I see that the Democrats, they wanted to move to remote voting for the House of Delegates. They needed 2/3 majority in order to do that. Thankfully, every single Republican voted against remote voting because that's ridiculous to allow delegates to sit in their house somewhere and cast votes. So, no, there's been a whole slew of things that I think really hurt the integrity of our elections. And again, I can't say I don't understand why they want to do it, but I certainly don't understand why the American people or the people of Virginia would ever put up with what they're trying to do.
Well, elections have consequences, Nick, and we got our head handed to us in 17 and 19. Caucus of the Corn took over. Saslow, the Godfather, took over. You have a Democratic governor. They're going to continue to manipulate the voting process in order to ensure power and victory, just like they're doing with this COVID-19. The goal is mail-in ballots, and the ultimate objective is to elect Joe Biden. As soon as we do that, there'll be an all clear, there'll be an immediate vaccine that somebody will come up with. All the models will be different, all the numbers will change. Nick, that's what the objective is. If they can manipulate the balloting system, they can gain power and keep it in perpetuity. That's their goal. Damn the torpedoes, straight ahead. Certainly, as you pointed out, Spanberger with the Tara Reid thing is totally hypocritical. Nick, I'm way over my time. Thank you for being with us. People want more info. Where do they go?
They go to nick4va.com. Also, follow us on Facebook. We've also got a podcast called Making the Argument, so there's a lot of different mechanisms to stay in touch with the campaign and what we're doing.